I will hand it over to Helen.
All right. Well, we are very pleased today to have Town Peterson, who many of us know, but maybe not everyone. He's a distinguished professor both in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at KU, as well as in the Biodiversity Institute. And I've known Town for a long time, but I just checked his website to see how he describes himself. And he has a wonderful phrase of studying the geography of biodiversity. I really like that phrase. And he does this in a lot of different ways. He and his students work in ornithology. They work in studies of the ecology of distribution of species, which often involves invasive species or endangered species, ecological niche models. And then he also has done a lot of work in disease ecology. And today what he's talking about has an intriguing title: Deeper Time Views of Landscape and Vegetation as Novel Information for Ecological Studies. So thank you, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Helen and Ben, for having me. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to go right into sharing my screen and putting some images up. Let's see. Okay, so I was just saying this is kind of my argument for the importance of tenure at institutions of higher education, because this is the sort of thing where you gamble a few years and maybe you learn something useful and maybe you don't. But you know, the investment is the only way to figure out if you can indeed learn something that you didn't know before. So essentially what I'm going to do is show you the first few years of some explorations of bringing in older sources of information as things that can inform us about ecological and biogeographic dynamics. And so I kind of will part from this review paper about the spatial and temporal domains of modern ecology. And essentially, this graphic says a lot of it. We study events that last between a second and a millennium, maybe longer if you're a systematist. And we study them over periods that are limited by our lifetimes and our careers and our energy. And this graphic shows you that we study events that are mostly of duration between a month and a decade. And we study them on fairly short time scales, like going out and sampling for a month or sampling for a year. But I really want you to notice that between decade and century, there's not a lot going on, which is to say that becomes a black hole for us where we don't have much illumination. And so let's think about a timeline. Let's think about kind of the last 150, 170 years of the landscape where we live. You know, Kansas becomes a state in the 1850s, KU's founded, Civil War. I had to look up when KBS was founded and when the Kansas Ecological Reserves were set up. If I'm wrong on the dates, forgive me, please. The Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And then we're out here, okay? And we all have kind of the shining example of Henry Fitch, who, you know, one individual, one study lasted more than half a century. But that's very much an outlier. It's a unique example. And so a lot of the studies we do are kind of out in this realm of relatively short duration, and not always taking into account all these other things that happened in the past, but especially their geography. So I did say, or Helen did say, that I'm interested in the geography of biodiversity, and that's very true. So what sorts of information resources can we use to look back into history? Well, our long-term studies maybe go back a decade or two or three, but they really don't generally, there are exceptions, but they don't generally go much farther than that. Remotely sensed data sets, Landsat, for example, would want to be one of the longest term ones, but those only go back to about 1980. And then if you really, really like suffering, there's aerial photography. And the aerial photography data sets go back till about 1940s with a little bit into the 30s. And so notice that a lot of our timeline, about half of our timeline, and certainly neglecting everything that was happening in this region before 1850, a lot of our timeline is kind of left out of anything that can give us a landscape level or regional level view of what was going on. And so I've started playing with some really non-traditional data sets, and you'll see how far I've gone into the non-traditional in just a moment. But I'm just asking, what can I learn from using historical views of landscapes that may not be, scientific data collections? And so this is actually the oldest photograph that I've come upon out of more than 2,000 that I've worked with so far. This is a really interesting photograph. It's Camp Saunders. It's a little bit southeast of Lone Star. The photograph is from 1856. And Camp Saunders was a pro-slavery encampment, one of 3 in Douglas County that kind of encircled Lawrence because there was this bleeding Kansas ongoing low-level war. And Camp Saunders was quite aggressive towards Lawrence, but was taken without a shot being fired when this camp of 30 or 40 men was surrounded by a force of 300 or 400 from Lawrence. And just recently, this past week, I've finally figured out where this landscape is. Essentially, it's a view from across Washington Creek up onto this hillside. And so this is the sort of comparisons I end up doing. And this finding Camp Saunders took me months of work. It's just one of those places that's not mapped very frequently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 examples of kind of quick science lessons that my colleagues and I have learned from making these deeper time before and after comparisons. 2 of them are in Mexico, 1 of them here in Kansas. And then I'll end with showing you some of the work I'll be doing into the future here in Kansas with the history of land use across Kansas. So let's start with one of these examples from Mexico. And this is in the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca in the south. And this is essentially something that, I mean, maybe I'm overly simplistic about this, but this really shocked me when I thought about it. If you look at the usual thinking about rates of land use conversion or essentially conversion of landscapes from natural habitats to anthropogenic landscapes, this is the usual thinking that, essentially it got worse over the course of the 20th century. In Mexico, my usual thought is that as chainsaws became available, everything accelerated. And so, this is an analysis of ecoregions and biodiversity hotspots worldwide. And essentially, this is not the main point of the paper, but you can see that cumulative land use change increases basically in the first half of the 1900s and into the second half as well. And so as part of a project that has a bunch of goals, I ended up in northern Oaxaca a couple years ago, one of my favorite places on earth. And we were in this region. Here's Oaxaca City, and we're going to go to San Pablo Guelatao and to another area over here that was a famous battlefield when Mexico threw out the emperor from Austria, Maximiliano. And I'm going to take advantage of an artist. Now, he was an interesting artist because his daytime job was as the scientific illustrator for Mexico's Natural History Museum, which at that point existed as a national museum. This is Jose Maria Velasco. But as near as I can tell, Velasco painted these fantastic landscapes to make extra money. And these really are fantastic. I mean, this particular painting is about 2 meters by 3 meters. And if you're ever in Mexico City, you want to go to the National Gallery, which is called Munal. And there's literally a whole floor dedicated to Jose Maria Velasco. And I had seen those paintings for decades whenever I was in Mexico. And then finally, with some funding from the Commons at KU, a bunch of colleagues got together, me and another biologist, a geographer, an art historian, a political historian, and a photographer. Sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it? And our question was, what would happen if you went back to the sites that Velasco painted and looked at those same views now? Well, it turns out that Velasco did these landscape paintings across most of central Mexico. This is Mexico City, where he did a lot of them, and he has kind of views from all of the major mountaintops that circle the Valley of Mexico. But then you can see he branched out into the Puebla area and the volcanoes southeast of Mexico City, down into Veracruz and down into Oaxaca. And I want to start by convincing you that Velasco was very much a photographic landscape painter. And this view is one of my favorite. It's from Atlisco in Puebla. And you can basically see zero change I mean, he didn't distort the positions of the peaks. He didn't move rivers. It's basically all the way he could see it, if you can find the exact same vantage point. And so over the course of a bunch of years, those colleagues and I revisited all 42 of these sites and retook very high quality photographs of what Velasco had painted. So now let's go on down into Oaxaca. And this is what blew me away. This painting was done in the 1890s. And what I want you to see is that there's no forest on the whole landscape, pretty much as far as you can see. This is at Guelatao, which Velasco visited particularly because it was the birthplace of Benito Juarez, who was a famous indigenous heritage former president of Mexico at that time. Here is La Carbonera, which was a very famous battlefield. I already mentioned that. And notice that you see the same thing. Not just the near part of this view, but the mountaintops in the background. Velasco shows us those mountaintops with no forest on them. And so this really impacted me quite a bit because it challenged how I think about forest destruction across Mexico. I had always imagined it as something that was very much a 20th century phenomenon. And this really pushes that time frame farther back. So if we look at these curves again, I'm just going to draw on top of them. It pushes the curve of forest destruction in northern Oaxaca at least back kind of like this into the 19th century. And we have some evidence that that destruction may have happened quite a bit earlier, when the occupying Spaniards were apparently grazing truly massive flocks of sheep and goats across Mexico. Now, which of these curves is true, I don't know. But it certainly is challenging me to rethink what forest disturbance means in Mexico, and particularly what does it mean for biodiversity conservation in the 21st century. So that's a first vignette. Now a second one. We're going to stay in Mexico. We're going to move away from the paintings, and we're going to go to photographs. And curiously, this paper was finally published yesterday. So I figured I'd throw in the view of what the reprint would look like. But we're gonna follow in the footsteps of these two men, Edward Nelson and Edward Goldman. These were Smithsonian biologists, or rather, Nelson was a Smithsonian biologist. And early in his career, when he was collecting out in California, he apparently stayed on an almond orchard in Central California and met Goldman, who had grown up on that orchard. And apparently Goldman made himself quite useful as far as helping with the collections. And so they end up then spending about 16 years traversing Mexico. This is not the best map because the state lines get mixed up with the smooth lines describing their travels. But I know of no 19th century effort that comes even close to this level of coverage of Nelson and of anybody's travels, and particularly documented by tens of thousands of specimens at the Smithsonian. And the wonderful thing is, Nelson for Baja California and Goldman for the rest of Mexico, they both provided monographic documentation of their sites with lots of photographs and very detailed descriptions. And so it's possible to reconstruct a lot of these, their movements. And if you're at all interested in this, I very highly recommend a movie. It's a documentary movie that's been produced recently, and it's winning one prize after another for documentaries at all the film festivals. It's called The Devil's Road. I'm actually a bit of a consultant on it, unpaid, but some of the rephotographs that I've done for Nelson and Goldman's trips actually come out in the movie. But it's quite an entertaining movie. And basically, it's a bunch of people, including, I think it was Goldman's granddaughter, and they decide to reconstruct the Nelson Goldman trips in Baja California. But instead of doing it on horseback, they do it on motorcycles. So if you want a fun evening, see that movie. So Nelson and Goldman left a few hundred photographs. I've worked the Smithsonian archives rather deeply. I was a little disappointed in their labeling of their photographs, shall I say. And so a lot of them end up not being useful anymore. But several hundred of them are useful. Here, just to give you an example, this is Lake Potsquado in central Mexico. And what I'd like you to notice, and this confused the heck out of me for quite a while, this island, I mean, that island's right, that island's right. The peak is mostly right in relation to the islands, but where's this island? It took me a little while to realize that it's part of the shoreline now because the lake level has gone down so far. Here are two more views. This is a view from near Puebla in a village called San Martin, looking towards the two volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Ixtaccíhuatl. You can see them then and now. This is from 4,600 meters on the slopes of Mount Orizaba, a volcano farther to the east. And so we've been working we're kind of rushing because we're coming up on the centenary of the end of the Nelson Goldman expeditions. And so we're thinking of a book documenting their landscapes and how they've evolved over the years. But here's the photo that really was thought-provoking. This is, from right about here, if you turn around 180 degrees, you see this other volcano called Sierra Negra, which is kind of encrusted on the side of Pico de Orizaba. And this is the view that Nelson and Goldman took in 1893. And this is the view that I took 3 years ago. And so if I put them together, notice the different extent of the trees. Essentially, we have trees up to about here, and here, that's bare rock. And that's not a consequence of recent lava flow, because Sierra Negra has not been active in that period. The trees also have come up this ridge that's in front of me quite a bit farther. And so I sat down and played for quite a while with digital elevation models, and it comes to about a 400-meter shift in 100 years. So that led to a whole series of discussions and debates. And Daniel Jimenez, whom some of you know, Daniel Jimenez and I sought out the assistance of Xingong Li in KU's geography department. We were joined by Andres Lira, whom some of you know. But essentially what we decided was, let's look at the 15 high volcanoes of central Mexico, of the transvolcanic belt that crosses central Mexico. And let's see what we can learn about tree line dynamics across this region. And so with Xingong, we were able to use some really spectacular computational tools in Google Earth Engine to develop this sort of visualization for every one of those 15 volcanoes. So watch, here's 1986, 2001, 2018. And if you focus on the middle of that upper panel, this is the cone of the Popocatépetl volcano. And watch right about here, see how the green creeps all the way up there in the most recent time slice. So obviously we put a lot of detailed analysis into this. Here's another way of seeing the same thing. This is a linear regression fit to NDVI values, so greenness or photosynthetic mass, related to elevation. This is for 7 example volcanoes. There are 8 more. And what I want you to notice is we have it for 3 time periods, and the most recent time period is in red. And what I want you to see is that the highest curve, which is to say, not a curved line, the line that is farthest to the right is the red one. It's the 2018 one. And so if you were to cut across at some cutoff of NDVI, where you would say, okay, this is tree line, then you would see that in each of these cases, except one, tree line, that cutoff of some NDVI value has moved upward in elevation. Now, Volcán La Malinche, which is a little farther north than the ones that I've been showing you, Malinche did not show us that same pattern. So it's 14 out of 15 volcanoes show that pattern. And so again, these are just vignettes, but what we observed and documented was in 14 out of the 15 volcanoes, a significant upward shift of tree line just between 1986 and 2018. We saw a significant compaction of this grassland zone. Sorry about that. This grassland zone. So you have forest in the dark green. The gray is bare rock, but this tan zone between the two is grassland. And that grassland zone, which is full of endemic species, has been compacted by this tree line shift. Essentially what happens is the trees apparently are able to move up into the grasslands, but none of the vegetation is able to move, at least quickly, up into the bare rock because there's simply not soil. And then the part that we're still working on is to integrate the historical photograph comparison with the satellite imagery-based comparison. But it looks like there's been an acceleration of about 8-fold, where the rate of tree line movement was quite slow between the 1890s and the 1980s, and then picked up again about 8-fold between the 1980s and present. Okay, and then a last vignette is here in Kansas. And this is work done with Bill Busby of the Kansas Biological Survey. But this is essentially asking some questions about forest dynamics here in Kansas. And when I started in Kansas, I thought this is going to be great because I don't have to wait. You know, I usually get to Mexico once or twice a year. I don't have to wait 6 months to do this work. I can just go out to, West Campus and take some of these pictures. And yeah, that's true, but what a pain in the butt it is not to have much topography and not to have the mountains that Mexico is so full of. So this is indeed the Chamney Farm building that's still standing on West Campus. And you can see a bare hilltop 80 years ago, and mostly bare on this side. And you can see it's filled in with that beautiful thing that Kansans call forest or timber. As an Ohioan, I don't really like it, but it certainly has taken over. And then in other places, this is out near the Tallgrass National Preserve. In other places, no change at all. So what Bill and Marlon Cobos, who I think is on this call, and Naraini Barve, whom some of you might remember, a past PhD student, but the four of us worked on this analysis. And I'm just going to walk you through it. But basically, Bill had 4 species of herps that are in Kansas and that are forest restricted. And so he just wanted to know, what can we learn about the distribution of these species using those fancy niche models that you guys do. And it was a long process. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically you see each of the 4 species in a different color: red for Plestiodon, black for Pseudacris, blue for Storaria, and green for Virginia. And you can see the calibration areas across which we developed our models. So the occurrence points for each species are shown in its color. Now, we're going to take advantage of a really interesting data source, these public land surveys, which the Kansas Historical Society, which is my best buddy in all this work, they've put it online. And so you can go in and probe the public land survey data and look at, it's not very detailed, but it's in terms of land use, but you can ask basically which areas were under forest in the 1850s. So here are the basic niche models, and I just want you to pay attention to the points and the purple. Okay, I'll come back to the green in a moment. But basically what you're seeing is from these points, relating the distribution of those points to a really broad set of environmental descriptors. We have distribution, which is this purple area. Okay, this darker purple area. You can see the models for store area weren't terribly specific, and maybe the models for pseudacris were overly specific, but they were all making predictions that were significantly better than random. And we had some interesting and lively discussions about what these models meant for these 4 species. However, remember those public land survey data. This is a zoom in on part of the pseudacris map. And where you see blue is where the niche models said suitable. And you see a lot of blue areas with no records. And that was something that Bill rightly brought up as, well, maybe your models aren't specific enough. And that can be a problem with these models. But then just out of curiosity, we brought in the public land survey data. And look at this. Notice that the occurrences of this species, and in fact for all of these species, the occurrences are within the blue areas, yes, but only where the blue areas overlap with the green areas, which are the areas that were under forest in the 1850s. And so this is telling us something about those niche models weren't specific enough, and we don't really know why. I'll come back to why in a moment. But there's more to it than the current distribution of environments. And so indeed, this works for all 4 of the species. I won't go through the whole detail of the table, but if we look at points in forest compared to points in suitable areas, you see that the points in the forest, given the proportion of the suitable area that's historically forested, the statistical significance is quite marked because the species are non-randomly focused in parts of their suitable area that were also forested in the 1850s. Now, what did we learn from this? Maybe not much, but again, this is inspiring to curiosity. So we could develop effective predictive models from current environments to anticipate the potential distribution of each of these 4 species. Each species was non-randomly associated with subsets of the model suitable or modeled suitable areas that held forest historically. But then you want to ask why. And we really couldn't, at this point, distinguish between 2 explanations. One is that forest has expanded in the past century, and maybe these species are not very mobile and have not been able to disperse out into and colonize those newly suitable forested areas. Or it could be that these species are actually responding to microscale environmental characteristics that are present in the areas that held forest historically, but are not manifested in this, kind of nouveau forest. We've got more work to do to figure out the difference and distinguish between these 2 explanations. I'm not sure how best to do it, but we've certainly discussed some ideas. Okay, so those are the 3 vignettes that I promised you. Now I'll show you 2 quick images and 1 detailed sequence about what I'm up to next. The 2 quick ones are partly for historical reasons. I mentioned before I started the talk, this study, I stumbled onto the Mapoteca Orozco Iberra, which is a historical map library in Mexico City, and walked in, and the curator was kind enough to show my friends and me around. And turns out there was a boundary survey of the boundary between Chiapas and Tabasco and other parts of the Mexican southern border and Guatemala in 1889, I believe it was. And they took abundant, beautiful photographs that are all referenced to the border monuments. And so one of the things I did most of June and July, when I didn't go out very much, was work through literally step by step the Mexican-Guatemalan border. And now I have very precise georeferencing for every one of these photographs, except for a few that I just couldn't figure out. So that's certainly one thing that I'll do, because the Mexico-Guatemala border is a really fascinating transition zone of different land use histories between the two countries. Another one, this is mostly for historical interest, but you guys have heard of Teddy Roosevelt. Certainly dreams of being an adventurer. Well, after he was president, and when he was a little bit frustrated because his re-election bid failed, if you've heard of the Bull Moose Party, you know what I'm talking about. So he accepts a speaking engagement in South America, and this kind of idea of, well, let's have a bit of an adventure coming back. Maybe let's, go down the Amazon River or something like that. It turns into, I'm going to give the Brazilian point of view on this, Roosevelt tagging along with this man, Coronel Rondon. Rondon, after whom Rondonia is named, had spotted the headwaters of a river a couple years before, but didn't have time or person power to figure out where this river went. And so Roosevelt gets roped into this expedition where they map 1,000 kilometers of unmapped river. And Roosevelt almost dies. But because he was the ex-president of the United States, there were abundant photographs. And so we're looking at the possibility of repeating this, this sequence. Let's just say the georeferencing of those photographs is quite a challenge. Anyhow, that's just ways to get into trouble. But here's what I've been spending most of my time on. My rule is I do, data-based science during the day, and this stuff I do in the evenings and weekends. But it's turning into something that will be empirical and analysis-based. So Kansas, and actually most of the states of the eastern US, have these historical atlases. They're known as plat books, and they go back basically to the arrival of Europeans on this landscape. This is for Miami County. And if you flip through, there are actual maps of who owns what, but there are also, in some of them, there are these lithographs that show ranches. They're inevitably drawn from bird's eye viewpoints. And I think, this is my guess, but I think that they are basically like vanity license plates where you could pay a little extra and the artist would draw your ranch. And if you notice, there's quite a bit of geographic information here. 3 miles south of Paola, on the such and such railroad, in Valley Township, Miami County, and then it gives the township section and range. And so I started playing with this, just wondering how much information is in these. And so first of all, the question was, can I locate it? And so you go into the same volume of the same atlas and you say, what was it, 3 miles south of Paola. These are sections, so 1, 2, 3. And notice that it's the residence of J.S. Bates. Well, there's J.S. Bates. And so I can zoom in on that. Here's J.S. Bates. Here's the residence. And look, there's the railroad. And so if you look here, there is, oh no, railroads. Oh yeah, there's the railroad right there. And so it's pretty clear that this view is taken from over here, looking that way. Now, obviously, in the 1880s, they didn't have any way of doing a bird's eye view. And what I have come to understand, I've talked with some of the people doing the historical research on this, is these were people who would find a vantage point and then imagine themselves as being a couple 100 feet up in the air. And they did a remarkably good job of this. And so I can go back out to that same site and retake the same picture. Of course, it involved me becoming a drone pilot, which is fun and scary and nerve-wracking and all that. But this is one of the cases where you get essentially an exact retake. And then you can start seeing, okay, this used to be orchard and cropland and pasture areas. And so there's actually quite a bit of land use information in these views. How do I stop this damn thing? There we go. So those of you who know me know that I usually jump in whole hog to things. So this is where things are at right now. The yellow triangles are those lithograph views from a bird's eye perspective, drawn all of them in the 1870s and 1880s. The red circles are photographs from the ground, but photographs that include significant landscape views. And then if you look carefully, you can see these blue X's that are kind of smeared across the whole state. But that's how much I've done so far. It's about 300. And actually, this map is a little out of date. All of this is now converted to blue X's. I've been up in Donovan County quite a bit in recent days. And so these are some other recent views. These are from Donovan County. Just giving you an idea of how much things have changed over the decades. This was the scariest one. This is a view from North Lawrence looking out over Lawrence. You can see many times even the original house is still there. So what am I going to do with this? Well, again, this is going to take me probably another year of drone flights. I'm focusing up in this region because in this region, in Donovan, Brown, Nemaha, and to a lesser degree, Riley, Potawatomi, Clay counties, I've got a lot of these views. Essentially, what I'm aiming to do is characterize a cluster of points within each of these views as some relatively detailed land use types, revisit those sites, rephotograph them, and tally the same land use in in current times to match the historical. Develop sets of spatial and environmental correlates like slope and distance to city, things like that. And then you can imagine we have a matrix of land use historically, land use presently, and some of the sites are going to stay in the same type of land use, whereas others are going to transition. We talked earlier about a transition from pasture to pasture or grass to forest. Or, for all the Johnson County sites, which I hate doing, It's pasture and grass to city. We also see a lot of historical orchards, which typically are pasture or cropland now. And so with some geography colleagues, I'm looking to essentially fit models to the independent variables of these spatial and environmental variables to try to predict transition probabilities from the historical land use to the current, and essentially understand what factors relate to those different transition probabilities. Okay, so that's kind of 3 quick initial insights into, can we possibly start moving into longer duration studies of longer duration phenomena? So essentially pushing up into this realm in this graph. Now, please bear with me. I know there are several other approaches to these same questions. My question and my curiosity is whether these approaches can add to that. I've learned some interesting lessons so far, and we'll see if any of those end up being useful to the broader community. So I'll stop there, and if you all have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.